Good morning and welcome to this week's edition of Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. One of the great achievements of the Obama administration in its last months was to sign a nuclear agreement with Iran. And this was an unexpected breakthrough because people had expected that Iran would never be prepared to negotiate on nuclear programs whose very existence it frequently denied. But this agreement, called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in the official jargon, was a major breakthrough at the time because it meant that Iran had to stop its nuclear processing activities. It was allowed to keep only a tiny amount of enriched uranium for medical and research purposes. It submitted itself to very stringent verification inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and it had to mothball many of its centrifuges and nuclear reactor programs at sites like Natanz and Fordow. Now, when President Trump came along in 2017, he abrogated the United States participation in this deal. He pointed to its imperfections, the fact that Iran was allowed still to test and deploy ballistic missiles, the fact that the deal did not constrain Iran's regional activities, and the fact that it was going to last only for 15 years. But arms control agreements are designed to limit arms. They're not designed to solve all of the problems of the world. And the deal, despite its imperfections, had advantages. It bought the West time to work out a more effective strategy to engage Iran. It established a trust which was lacking between the United States and Iran. It pushed Iran back from the threshold of being able to deploy a nuclear weapon in less than a year. It provided, as I've said, for good verification and also for so-called snapback sanctions that would click in automatically if Iran was not in compliance. So yes, it was imperfect, but an imperfect deal, I would argue, is always better than no deal at all. Now, the European Union in particular has been trying to keep the Iran nuclear deal alive by trying to find ways to trade with Iran. But frankly, since the US pulled out, the Iranians have really lost their appetite to continue to comply. And more recently, there have been worrying signs that Iran has now gone back to enriching uranium up to 20%, which is 9/10 of the way to weapons grade material for a nuclear bomb. It's introduced a new high-speed centrifuges at its Natanz plant, and it's experimenting with so-called uranium metal, which is necessary to produce the core of a nuclear weapon. This has caused the new incoming Secretary of State in the US, Tony Blinken, to declare that Iran may be now just weeks away from being able to have a nuclear weapon. So it's urgent that the international community now tries to rescue the Iran nuclear deal while we still can. And there are three reasons for this. Number one, the Trump alternative policy of maximum pressure, trying to drive the Ukrainians to the wall, clearly never worked. Iran is a country that's been used for generations now to living under international sanctions, and that pressure never curtailed their nuclear programs in the past. And number two, that if Iran did acquire a nuclear capability, this would ramp up tensions with Israel and other countries immediately, and possibly lead to Israeli strikes and a wider conflict in the Gulf region. Number three, it's clear that if Iran succeeds in getting the bomb, countries like Saudi Arabia, possibly Turkey, possibly the United Arab Emirates that have had their own incipient nuclear programs, for example, Saudi Arabia is cooperating with China at the moment, would follow suit, and non-proliferation regimes would be blown out of the water. But getting back to the deal is not going to be easy. Republicans in the United States will want a deal to be broadened, to have things like ballistic missiles or Iran's regional behavior be brought in. Some Republicans have called for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to join the negotiations, which Iran has refused. And Iran itself, there are conservatives who will argue, well, can we trust the United States again? They broke the deal before, even though there was no indication that we were cheating, so why trust them? But it can nonetheless be done. Now, how can the deal be rescued? Number one, we need to resume talks, which the United States and the Iranians seem to be prepared to do. The Iranians have usually suggested that the EU could go back to chairing those talks and acting as a mediator, looking at reciprocal moves and concessions from both sides. Number two, the 6 countries that negotiated with Iran, that's the United States, China, Russia, the UK, France, and Germany, must adopt a common position. For example, Russia has been suggesting that the sanctions on Iran be lifted before Iran makes nuclear concessions. That's not acceptable to the United States, so we need a common position. Number 3, the Iranian parliament should stop this talk about throwing out the international inspectors and confirm that that verification will continue. Next, Iran could make some useful gestures to the West to restore confidence, like, for example, not testing or deploying new ballistic missiles, stop hijacking ships in the Gulf. It recently hijacked a South Korean ship and held it hostage, and also helping the West out in Afghanistan. It's been interesting that this week the political director of the Taliban, Mullah Baradar, has been in Tehran having talks. The Iranians could certainly put pressure on the Taliban in the Qatar talks to negotiate seriously with the government of Afghanistan. That seems to be suggesting that the Iranians have to do a lot, which is true. But what would they get in exchange? They would get the lifting of sanctions, a resumption of technology deliveries, spare parts for their civilian aviation, the resumption of oil and gas exports, the resumption of investments, and the unfreezing of their assets that have been blocked by the United States and other countries. So both sides have an enormous amount to gain. Now, diplomacy is the art of the impossible, and often getting things done in the first place is difficult enough. Resurrecting a deal is probably even more difficult as time has moved on. But the fact of the matter is that every week goes by brings Iran closer to developing a nuclear weapon. Once Iran has a nuclear weapon, it may not want to give it up, as we've seen from the example of North Korea and other states. So time is of the essence here. The further these sides drift apart, the harder it will be for them to come back together. Thank you very much for watching today, and I hope to see you again this time next week. Bye for now.